I'm I.B. Sutherland, the president of the Wachovia Historical Society. I welcome you to the 125th annual meeting of our society. We come to you in a different setting this year. We thank the Moravian Music Foundation and the Moravian Archives for hosting us at the Archie K. Davis Center. I now call on the Reverend Dr. Nola Canals to lead us in our invocation.
Let us pray. God, we acknowledge that you are the God of our past, the God of our present, and the God of our future. We remember with thanks the many ways you have shown your love throughout all of history, your goodwill toward all that you have created, your saving work in Jesus Christ our Lord, and the outpoured gifts of your Holy Spirit. We thank you that in remembering our past, we can take courage for the present and hope for the future. For in seeing your presence with our forebears, we can be assured of your presence and guidance in these our days. May we receive inspiration in our remembrances. May we be emboldened to act in compassion and justice for all today. May we be encouraged with hope for our future, in the certainty that you are with us and with all your children, now and forevermore. In the holy name of our Savior, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
We as a board of the society have had a very, very busy year. We had several board meetings before the pandemic made it impossible to meet. We have since held board meeting and committee meetings by Zoom. We continue to do the business of our society. Our property committee continues to work on the care of the Adam Smock property. We formed a task force to come to the board with ideas for the best use of the property. That committee continues to work on this important project. We have worked closely with Johanna Brown, Director of Collections and Curator of Moravian Decorative Arts at Old Salem Museum and Gardens, and our staff and their staff, and new lease for our society at Old Salem for our collections. Our goal is to have this finished by the end of October this year. I call on Mr. Kirk Sanders for a report of the Nominations Committee.
Good evening. My name is Kirk Sanders. I'm the secretary and I'm also the chair of the Nominations Committee. So we have first the nominations for Board of Directors, and this is passed. The prior Board of Directors have voted on these names for this slate. First is Zach Ruth. Zach is a young teacher in Raleigh. He hails from Grace Moravian Church in Mount Airy, among other Moravian churches. He's a history enthusiast. He will be taking John Dyer's spot, and John resigned because of time commitments. For the three remaining spots, Bill Phillips, who's no stranger to the Wachovia Historical Society. He's been on the board in previous years. He's had a large hand in the High Point Museum as well as some Davidson County historical projects. Next is Jimmy Snyder, also no stranger to the Wachovia Historical Board. He is known, full of knowledge with the Rock House down in Davidson County. He also has a heavy hand in the Friedberg Moravian Museum. And last is, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Zach Ruth is taking a 4-year spot. It was Robert Spall who's taking John Dyer's spot. Robert is an attorney in Davidson County. In addition, for a second term is Ed Hills coming on for a second 4-year term. We'd like to thank the Board of Directors members that have finished out their second term, Paul Armfield and myself, Kirk Sanders. That is the slate for the Board of Directors, and that has passed by the board in a previous vote. Now for the slate of officers. President is Michelle DeLapp, Vice President Jimmy Snyder, Secretary Victoria Remishki, and Treasurer Carl Kapp. We'd like to thank, there's been one change to the board. I.B. Sutherland has served us not one term, not 2 terms, but 3 terms as president. So we'd like to thank I.B. Sutherland for his dedicated service to the society. Those are the slates, and they have been passed by the board of directors. Since we don't have an open meeting here, that's going to be our vote.
Elections of new directors and officers was presented to the board and was passed. Since we are coming to you by YouTube, we're unable to have a member vote this year. As we reach out for new directors, we encourage you to contact the chair of the nomination committee with your suggestions. I call on Ms. Eric Elliott, the Archivist of the Moravian Archives, to introduce our guest speaker this evening.
Our speaker tonight served as Archivist of the Moravian Church in the Southern Province for 23 years, from 1991 to 2014. John Larson relays the story of how at Old Salem, when tonight's speaker was at the archives, his very name became an action verb. For whenever there was an uncertainty about an interpreted point in Moravian history, the advice was, see Daniel Cruz. C. Daniel Cruz, initial C, received his Bachelor of Divinity and Master of Divinity degrees from Moravian Theological Seminary, a PhD in British Literature from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and a PhD in Historical Theology from the University of Manchester in England. He did postdoctoral work at the University of Prague not long after the turbulent events there in 1968. Grounding his future narratives about the history of the church and its practice, Daniel served as Moravian minister at churches in England and the Virgin Islands, as well as in North Carolina. When he got to the archives in 1991, he began work finishing the publication of the book series begun by our first archivist, Adelaide Fries, The Records of the Moravians in North Carolina, and he co-edited volumes 12 and 13, taking our translated published records through 1876. In anticipation of the 250th anniversary of the Moravian Church in the Southern Province in 2003, he began writing a series of thematic booklets on the church's history with stories from that record series. And in 2002, along with Richard Starbuck, he wove those themes into the magisterial volume With Courage for the Future, a reference text I use weekly. Daniel's prolific publication list includes studies on Moravian hymnody and composers with Nola Reed Knaus of the Moravian Music Foundation, and works on the greater history of the church with a biography of John Huss and an essay on the tenets of Moravian theology. As a capstone to his career at the archives, in 2008 he began editing the series Records of the Moravians Among the Cherokees, which now, under editor Richard Starbuck, is in its 10th volume. The archivists and translators associated with that Records Cherokee project, including Daniel, just this month received the 2020 Samuel Worcester Award, given by the Cherokee Nation to non-Cherokees who have made substantial contributions to the preservation of Cherokee heritage, culture, community, and sovereignty. In 2013, Daniel won the John Huss Award from the Moravian Theological Seminary for outstanding service by an alumnus to the ministry of the church. And in 2003, he won this Wachovia Historical Society's own Archie K. Davis Award. And I should mention that in his retirement, Daniel served on the Provincial Elders Council, the governing body of the provincial church. He has lived a life of dedication to church and community. Daniel always conveys a wealth of information with stories that are crafted with care for the subject being discussed and for the reader and listener. In these times when there is hunger for true information and a need for caring pastoral guidance, I can think of no better speaker for this year's gathering than C. Daniel Cruz.
I want to thank the Society directors for inviting me to address you tonight in what I am assuming will be my swan song. I don't necessarily mean that I will never speak again in public, and I sure don't want to emulate Cher in having a 49th final retirement tour, but I do expect this will be my last major address before such an esteemed audience. I am, of course, aware of the honor of being asked to speak at the annual meeting. I also suspect that this invitation has more to do with a certain address I gave to a pumpkin at last year's annual meeting than it does with any academic achievements I may have garnered over the last 50 years. And that's fine with me. While I very much appreciate the sound academic procedure and carefully documented details of others who have stood before you in past years, most of whom have been compelling speakers, at this point I have no desire to go rooting around among obscure Eastern European publications which have been extinct for over 100 years and are written in several languages almost no one can read anymore. Been there, done that, got the check t-shirt, declared victory, and came home in triumph. So, when Johnny Pearson asked me some months ago to give the annual address this year, I said at once that I would not be interested in giving a scholarly lecture on deep academic topics, valuable and necessary as those may be. What I would want to do was to think back over things I have run into during my years as minister and archivist and come up with several short vignettes of some of those persons related to Wachovia that I found most interesting. Also, to my mind, interesting doesn't mean just important, but also usually includes a bit of fun. As you may have heard me say in my younger years, I had to doze through enough boring history lectures that I swore I would never knowingly inflict that on anyone else. Now, Johnny said he was fine with that approach, and the other directors agreed. I trust that is okay with the audience tonight. I realize that such an approach is not without risk, as when many decades ago one of the reviewers of my MA thesis, though thank heavens he changed his mind quickly, but one of the reviewers of my MA thesis initially said the thesis couldn't be academically sound because it was too interesting. And so we begin. The first person we're going to deal with, at least briefly, never set foot in North Carolina. We include him, however, because if it weren't for him, none of us would be here tonight. This, of course, is Count Nicholas Ludwig Vancinzendorf. This is how we think of him, and this is about what he looked like when Wachovia was being settled. Everyone was young once, however, and this is how he looked at 20, shortly before he met the Moravians at Herrnhut. We know his name, but he is better known in Germany than in the United States. At least the German government in 2000 issued a postage stamp to mark the 300th anniversary of his birth. Now, Zinzendorf was a bit different from the beginning. While other children were out playing their equivalent of cowboys and Indians, except in their case it was Christians and Turks, the young count was assembling the household staff and preaching to them using an overturned chair as a pulpit. As soon as he could write, he composed a note to Jesus every night and stuck it into a crack in the stonework outside his window for the angels to take up to heaven. What he didn't know was that an old family retainer's regular job each evening was to remove the letter and send it off to heaven via the fireplace. Zinzendorf early on decided he wanted to be a minister. This shocked his family, for it was unthinkable for someone of his exalted social status to demean himself to serve as a humble clergyman. This caused no little tension, and when the time came, they shipped him off to law school to prepare for service in the court of the Elector of Saxony, as all good little counts should. He was always a kind and generous person. As the time of his marriage approached, he learned that his friend, Count Reutz, was in love with the girl Zinzendorf was supposed to marry. In a noble gesture, He renounced all rights to the lady and magnanimously told his friend Royce that he could have her. You may note, however, that it never seemed to occur to either of these men to consult the young woman as to her own preferences. Apparently, she was okay with it and possibly relieved with the switch, for she and Count Royce had a long and happy marriage, and Zinzendorf himself married Erdmut Dorothea, therefore known as the Countess. And here's where we enter the story. Zinzendorf was always in favor of the underdog and was frankly a sucker for a hard luck story. And there were few more hard luck stories than that told him by an itinerant carpenter named Christian David about persecuted Czech Protestants whose own church had been destroyed after the 30 Years' War. Since then, they had secretly maintained their old faith in spite of persecution and were looking for a place where they could worship freely. Preoccupied with his marriage, Zinzendorf almost offhandedly told Christian David that he could bring some of the Czech exiles to stay temporarily on an unused portion of his Berthelsdorf estate until they could find a permanent home elsewhere. When returning from his honeymoon, Zinzendorf noted some new buildings on the estate and asked the driver what they were, and the reply was, "Oh, that's the Moravians," since that particular group of exiles was from Moravia. Thus, the name by which our church eventually came to be known in English-speaking lands was Moravians. Zinzendorf soon found that having the Moravians to come to his estate temporarily was something of an error. He couldn't get rid of them. In the events leading up to the renewal experience of August 13th, the Count probably regretted his having let the exiles come, as more people came from varying backgrounds, and the community splintered with one another and one dispute after another. We need not go into all of that, but a couple of details are worth noting. In May of 1727, Zinzendorf and the Herrenhuters, as the village came to be called, they joined in what came to be known as the Brotherly Agreement. And through various metamorphoses, this has become our covenant for Christian living today. This was not, however, an agreement arrived at mutually in brotherly or even sisterly concord. It was rather originally a manorial statute issued by Zinzendorf as the feudal lord of the estate, saying that anyone who was not willing to abide by its terms to treat one another civilly had to get out of town. It has developed over the years. We have also learned that after the experience of unity on August 13th, the newly reconciled sisters and brothers stayed talking with one another, and that the Count had a simple meal sent down to them from the manor house, thus the origin of our love feast. I dispute that. The Count was a tender-hearted fellow, but he was not practical. He could get so caught up and excited in a grand scheme that he might have to be reminded to eat. I'm not saying he would have begrudged the food to those folks. He probably just wouldn't have thought of it. I'm pretty sure it was Mrs. Zinzendorf, the Countess, who sent the food. Zinzendorf finally got to realize his childhood dream of becoming an ordained minister when he received approval for Lutheran ordination from the University of Tübingen in 1734. He also became a Moravian bishop in 1737, but that's a different story. When he arrived in America in late 1741, he had full ministerial credentials as he tried to bring union among the various German Protestant denominations in Pennsylvania, a futile effort as it turned out. He also made 3 journeys into the wilderness to preach to the Indians. His life was really in danger a couple of times, and he certainly exhibited great courage. My favorite story, which resulted from these trips, came later when Henry Antes, the father of composer John Antes, objected to the introduction of the surplice into the Moravian church for baptisms and communion. Antes considered this papist nonsense. The Count tried not to trade too much on his noble titles, and in Pennsylvania wanted to be known simply as Mr. Turnstein, which was a minor title he was entitled to. At times, though, his noble gene pool would reassert itself, and Henry Antes got the brunt of it. The Count thundered in effect, "If I, a Count of the Holy Roman Empire, can celebrate communion barefoot and in buckskins in the wilds of Pennsylvania, then Brother Antes can get used to the surplice as Jesus intended." I said that Vancinzendorf never got to North Carolina. Pennsylvania was as close as he got. He did, however, encourage the purchase of the Wachovia tract, and even sent a plan for its future central town, which he named Unitas. This stately plan would have been great on the plains of eastern Germany, but was impossible in the hills of Piedmont, North Carolina. His agent on the spot, Frederick William Marshall, later wisely ignored the Count's plan and built Salem instead. It's easier to get forgiveness than permission. Though Zinzendorf didn't get his way on Unitas and a lot more, it is still true that we wouldn't be here tonight without him. We turn now to someone who definitely set foot in North Carolina and covered a lot more ground here than he ever wanted to. August Gottlieb Spangenberg, nicknamed Brother Joseph, because, like the biblical Joseph in Egypt, he took such loving care of his brethren in the wilderness. This is how we usually picture him, but this was made when he was in his 80s living in retirement in Germany. He was in his 50s, though, when slogging through the briar patches of what became Wachovia. And here's a picture from the Bethlehem archives closer to that time. For many years, Spangenberg was a fount of sage and practical advice. If you wanted a vision climbing to the stars, ask Zinzendorf. If you wanted a job done simply and well and actually finished, give it to Spangenberg. One example of such practical advice is when Moravian merchants wondered what price to charge for their wares. Spangenberg suggested that they find out what others were charging, and then he said, don't charge the highest price to make exorbitant profit, but don't charge the cheapest either, which might mean using inferior ingredients and shoddy workmanship. Charge a median price so that your customers can get good quality ware and you can make a comfortable but not luxurious living. It should therefore come as no surprise that when someone was needed to lead an exploratory party to select land offered by Lord Granville for sale to the Moravians in North Carolina, the choice fell on Spangenberg. He was not always infallible, but he quickly learned from his mistakes. For instance, as the explorers traveled to the west, some of them came down with a fever. Spangenberg was impatient to move on, and I'm sure he encouraged them with the assurance that God would give them strength, etc. However, after going only 5 miles, Spangenberg himself fainted and fell off his horse. I can imagine him lying there on the ground and saying, well, perhaps the Lord does intend for us to take a short rest here. His descriptions of the journey are vivid. At one point, he speaks of the mountains stretching out before them like the waves of the sea. Those who have enjoyed the view from the high deck at Laurel Ridge will agree that he nailed it. On occasion, his remarks were pithier. He grumbles that the guide provided by the Earl of Granville's agent, quote, seems to be better acquainted with the inside of a whiskey bottle than he is with the interior of North Carolina. With all 99,985 acres selected and surveyed, it was Spangenberg on the way back to Pennsylvania who gave the name Wachovia, since the lay of the land reminded him of an ancestral estate of Zinzendorf in Austria, Die Wachau. An official at Wachovia Bank once phoned me to learn what Indian dialect Wachovia came from. He was disappointed to learn that it is the Latinized form of the German name of an Austrian estate. It was Spangenberg who, in a letter from Pennsylvania during the French and Indian War, advises the construction of the stockade at Bethabara. He even added some construction hints they had picked up building a similar one at Bethlehem. Now, people often wonder what the pacifist Moravians were doing building a stockade. I always explained that while the Moravians did not want to engage in active militia operations and going out and looking for enemies to fight, they would defend themselves if attacked. My favorite story to explain this, and you may have heard this one before, my favorite story concerns not the Moravians, but an old Quaker in Guilford County. One night his wife woke him to say she thought she heard a burglar downstairs. He went to investigate and sure enough found a man loading the family pewter into a bag. The old Quaker, cocking his musket, said, "Pardon me, brother, I would not harm thee for the world, but thou art standing where I'm going to shoot." By 1789, when Spangenberg was living in semi-retirement in Europe, many felt the use of the lot to confirm decisions should be abandoned. Spangenberg himself was not in favor of this alteration. He preferred to hold to tradition. I am told that the elderly are sometimes uncomfortable with change. At the General Synod of that year, he was elected to preside at the sessions. However, the lot did not ratify his election. At that point, he might well have begun to wonder if the lot had indeed outlived its usefulness. Our next person of interest is Frederick William Marshall. More than any other, he determined the physical and economic and spiritual shape of early Wachovia. He was not born Frederick William Marshall, but rather Friedrich Wilhelm von Marschall, to a somewhat aristocratic German family. The fun is a definite giveaway. His family intended him for either military service or a position in the Saxon court. He therefore received a rigorous education focusing on dealing with practical matters. One of his tutors, however, recommended the Moravian Church to him, and he decided to devote his life to its service. He was very helpful in negotiating the British Parliament's recognition of the Moravians as an ancient Protestant Episcopal church, which proved to be of great advantage to the church, not only in America, but also worldwide. He was also a benefit to the church in Germany, and especially in England. He liked the English and took trouble to learn the English language well. Afterwards, he preferred plain Frederick William Marshall to Friedrich Wilhelm, etc. He also admired English architecture, and particularly the Georgian arches over doorways, which was popular in England at the time. In designing Home Church, he used a simplified version of this on the front of the building, which quickly became known as a Moravian arch. And everyone assumed that every Moravian church had to have one. People are often disconcerted to find that this is used only in the southern province and is unknown elsewhere in the Moravian world. With his practical upbringing and attention to detail, he was the natural choice to oversee the building of the Moravian central town in Wachovia. We've already noted that he quietly shelved Zinzendorf's grandiose scheme for Salem to fit the local topography. Fortunately, Zinzendorf, late in his life, had decided to call the central town Salem instead of Unitas. Brother Marshall literally drew the plans for Salem. He assembled plats of Moravian centers all over the world and then put their best ideas together according to the terrain here. In the early stages of building, Brother Marshall had to return to Pennsylvania for a while. When he returned to Wachovia, he found the local brethren had talked together and had decided to move the location of Salem Square 1 block to the north, and had already built the first houses on the west side of Main Street just north of the new location. When Brother Marshall returned, they explained what they had done, and he said, in effect, "All right, you have decided, and everyone gets a vote. However, I get one more vote than all of you put together. Put it back." And that's where it is today. But this explains why those first houses are further north rather than just above the square, as would have been expected. Unfortunately, Brother Marshall had returned to Europe for the 1775 General Synod. The outbreak of the American Revolution meant that he was not able to return to Wachovia until 1778. His leadership was sorely missed during those dangerous times. Fortunately, while back in Europe, he had had the deeds for Wachovia transferred to his name from that of James Hutton in England. Society at that time did not recognize a corporation or institution as capable of owning property, so it had to be in somebody's name. Well, a literal body's name. During the Revolution, radicals in North Carolina attempted to confiscate all lands belonging to absentee British landlords. The local Moravians had managed to delay, obfuscate, and otherwise frustrate the plans for the confiscation of Moravian properties in the colony. Brother Marshall arrived just in time with his deeds in his own name, that of a legal resident of North Carolina. For the rest of the 18th century, Brother Marshall gave the province calm, considered, and steady leadership until his death in 1802. Throughout, he evidenced the best qualities of Bishop Spangenberg. This means that for 40 years, he was head of what became the Provincial Elders Conference. I myself served on the PEC for 4 years, and that was quite enough. And we didn't have the minor inconvenience of the Revolutionary War to deal with. 40 years? Nothing gives better evidence of his firm inner core and grounded faith than those 40 years. My only surprise is that he did not end up a raving lunatic. So the next time you are driving on Marshall Street, give a kind thought to Friedrich Wilhelm von Marshall, a.k.a. Frederick William Marshall. This next section will be rather brief. I want to mention this period for it was an important time of transition between the original Wachovia settlements and what the province was later to become. By the 1820s, most of the first settlers had gone on to glory. It was their grandchildren who were growing into maturity, and it is common that the second and especially the third generations do not hold enthusiastically to the principles of their forebears, at least not in the same way their forebears did. During the American Revolution, Bishop Groff had remarked with puzzlement, "We hear a lot these days about American freedom, which we do not understand." The younger generation certainly did, and they looked upon themselves not as immigrant pioneers, but as natural-born citizens of a rambunctious new nation. For instance, the Salem elders were shocked, positively shocked, to hear that single brothers and single sisters were taking drives together in the country without chaperones. This obviously had to stop. The proprieties will be observed. Of course they did. More people were asserting their constitutional rights to own slaves. One home church council broke into such rancorous argument that several members stalked out and Holy Communion had to be postponed until a better spirit reigned. At Bethania, a dispute arose over cleaning up a pond. Now, disputes at Bethania are nothing unusual, but instead of waiting for the church boards to mediate, the people involved went direct to secular law courts and sued one another. Church members were less willing to live under church regulations. Johanna Nissen Fries wrote to her son, who was away at school, complaining about the silly Aufseher Collegium, that's Board of Trustees, who were trying to interfere in people's lives. They are ridiculed in the village, she said. An interesting note to this is that Sister Free's own husband was serving on the trustees at the time. What this meant for their domestic relations, we do not know. We suspect, though, that the phrase, "yes, dear," came more often from the male side of the household. It fell to the lot of Bishop Andreas Bonatta to navigate these vastly altered circumstances as president of PEC in the 1820s. Mostly he did pretty well, though there were exceptions, as when he and the other conference member assumed that the small Hope congregation would not mind simply being merged into Friedberg. No one who knows anything about Moravian congregational loyalties should have made that mistake. Hope, by the way, is still very much in existence. The most striking thing about Bishop Bonatta was his physical appearance. To me, he looks like Count Dracula in a 1930s horror film. If he were summoned to the PEC president's office, I could almost hear him say, "Good evening," in a Hungarian accent. As always, moral lesson, physical appearances alone should never determine our suppositions about a person's character and worth. Now, some of you may have noted, and perhaps with some consternation, that thus far we have heard little about women in Wachovia. Don't assume from this that I have anything against women. My mother was a woman. In fact, God gave me two wonderful mothers, and they were both women. But for the early years, it is not so easy to focus on particular individuals. The obvious choice, hands down, is Anna Contrita. However, Adelaide Fries in The Road to Salem gave such an iconic portrayal of Anna Katrina that it would be a desecration to mess with her account. So who else might we feature? Well, the contribution of women in the early years of Wachovia was certainly infinitely more than keeping the birth rates up. Both wives of Zinzendorf, the Countess and Anna Nitschmann, were memorable characters in their own right. So were the two wives of Spangenberg, and one of them was a very gifted hymn writer. However, they had nothing personally to do with Wachovia. Hedwig Marshall, the wife of Frederick William, was well beloved, but there isn't much exciting to say about her. Zinzendorf's daughter Benigna was also a formidable figure, but she likewise had nothing directly to do with Wachovia other than several of her descendants became leading families here, and they know who they are, and I don't have to tell them, though I have no doubt they will be willing to tell you if you ask. So, who else might we consider? Well, there are, of course, the first married sisters in Wachovia, whose arrival in 1755 put an end to the original Single Brethren's 2-year macho man's camping trip in North Carolina. The women quickly informed the brethren that they could no longer wander naked down to the creek for a wash. They were also required to put curtains over their windows. There were also those single sisters who walked all 500 miles from Bethlehem to North Carolina. While it is true they didn't have to contend with tractor-trailers on the interstate, they nevertheless had their own trials and dangers, which earn our respect. However, all these sisters seem to have acted collectively rather than as individuals. As I pondered this problem of introducing some women characters, my thoughts turned to Anna Rosina Gombold, who labored spectacularly in the Cherokee Mission. Sadly, her sphere of service was in Georgia, not Wachovia. And then I had it, Lucinda Baga. She was a homegrown girl who achieved great importance in her own right, not as the wife of a church official, etc. Lucinda was the granddaughter of Traugott Baga, the well-known keeper of the Salem store. He was hard-working and talented man, and by his life's end had accumulated a considerable fortune. The main thing for us is that Lucinda ended up with all of Granddaddy's money. Rather, the important thing for us is what Lucinda did with it. She always contributed generously to the needs of the church. Specifically, the province in her day was short of ministers and even more short of money. Times change. In 1851, she set up a fund of $250 a year to supplement a minister's income. And remember that $300 a year was a good income in those days. Specifically, she thus enabled Christian Lewis Wrights to return to ministerial service and Freeland to have a pastor. This is not to say Lucinda Baga was the only person in Salem to be able to do this. She was, however, the only person in Salem who was willing to spend her money to do this. Now we're on to something, I thought. That's all I knew of her off the top of my head, but I was sure her memoir would supply more details to make an interesting presentation on her life and works, and maybe a few quirks as well. However, I found she has no memoir on file in the archives. So much for that. I do hope you have intended my taking a page and a half to tell you that I have nothing to tell you. Do not assume, though, that we are through with women in this talk. However, there is indeed more to follow. I should also take this opportunity to note that there are no African Americans in this series of vignettes. African Americans were certainly crucial in the building and maintaining of Wachovia and continue to play a part in its spiritual life. However, since the focus here is to spotlight some of the foibles and idiosyncrasies of Wachovia characters, it did not seem right to poke fun, however gently, at people who had to endure the abomination of slavery and its terrible ongoing vestiges. See Neither Slave Nor Free for an appreciative account of the African Americans in Wachovia. To continue. We mentioned Christian Lewis Wrights above, and I would like to take a few minutes to talk about him. He was born in the environs of Salem, and yes, he is of the same family as Burton, Graham, etc., just not the same branch. He did not set out to be a minister. Indeed, he trained as a printer. When I say printer, I mean someone who, with the technology of the time, put the little pieces of type together to make blocks for printing. Certainly, he was in no sense an editor. His own spellings and punctuations are in a universe of their own. I recall once looking at a handwritten document of his and saying, well, it's definitely not German, so it must be English, I think. Fortunately, our sainted Grace Robinson, blessed be she, could usually make out what he meant, if not exactly what he said. Christian Lewis, however, did have a desire to serve the church, so he also served as a lay home missionary in the mountains of Virginia, thus carrying on the work of Van Nieman Zevely, whose name, judging from the way contemporaries misspelled it, was probably pronounced Veneman. Anyway, Christian Lewis would roam the hollers and gaps, passing out gospel tracts, talking with mountain folk about their souls, and if occasion offered, give short exhortations. Over the course of 3 years or so, he proved quite good at this. Then in 1846, the Friedland congregation needed a change in its pastor, but no clergyman was available. PUC considered Christian Lewis Rice for the post. After all, he'd done quite well as home missionary. The problem was he had absolutely no formal theological training, nor hardly any formal education at all, for that matter. Serving a regular congregation is different from wandering up in the hills. Still, they had no other option, so they decided to send him to Friedland as a sort of lay assistant pastor for a year or so and see how he did. It was not the first or last time that PUC has said, we couldn't find anybody competent for the job, so we're sending you. Brother Wrights apparently again did well, for in 1847, Friedland requested that he be called as their regular pastor, and his ordination was approved. However, after 3 years or so, Friedland proved unable to pay him enough to support his wife and family. He then returned to whatever secular work he could find and resumed his home missionary activity. Then enters Lucinda Baga and her kind offer of $250 a year to support and supplement a minister's salary. Brother Wrights was then able to resume his ministry at Friedland until 1854. In addition to Friedland, in 1852, he was appointed to home missionary work again, this time to Walltown, Kernersville, and the county poorhouse. Then he was called to be pastor at Friedberg, Hope, and Macedonia, simultaneously, not consecutively. Brother Wrights got into a spot of trouble with PEC in 1858 when he began holding a series of evangelistic services at Friedberg. Not Friedland, as he later recalled. Apparently, those two congregations were often confused back in those days as well. Anyway, these gatherings were then called protracted meetings, and in the 20th century, revivals. PUC, worried by such non-Moravian things as shouting and groaning, sometimes referred to them as Methodistical camp meetings. Brother Wrights was admonished to tone it down a bit. There is no arguing with success, however, and many converts joined the Moravian Church through his efforts. PEC basically pretended they didn't know what was going on. In 1865, not only did the Provincial Synod approve revivals as helpful evangelistic outreach, but it elected Christian Lewis Wrights to PEC. The spiritual impetus provided by Brother Wrights' efforts lasted beyond the Civil War years and laid the foundation for the province's phenomenal progress under Edward Rontaller. Brother Wrights then served other congregations, most noticeably Kernersville, his longest pastorate. In 1865, as I've said, he was elected to PEC. In 1880, he became president of PEC. That was not his only responsibility, however, for in the 1880s, as well as being PEC president, in addition to Kernersville, he served as pastor of Friedland again, Mount Bethel, New Philadelphia, Providence, and Macedonia, all at the same time. And there was no Interstate 40 or Salem Parkway or Highway 52 to zoom from one to another in those days. Well, in 1883, Brother Wrights again performed a life-saving work for the province. Plagued by constant financial insolvency and a chronic shortage of ministers, the southern province reluctantly concluded that union with the northern province was their best option. A joint union commission was appointed, details were worked out, the northern delegates had signed the papers, and the southern delegates were prepared to sign. All it lacked was 2 more signatures, and the southern province was no more. At the last moment, however, 2 of the southern delegates, Edward Rontaller and Christian Lewis Wrights, simply could not bring themselves to sign. Slowly, I believe, they had come to see that union would not actually help the South financially, for expenses as a district would not be less locally, and in addition, we would have to pay our share of another level of provincial bureaucracy on top, in addition to supporting northern province endeavors. In addition, southern province affairs would then ultimately be in the hands of officials 500 miles away who did not know or understand our congregations and people. So, in 1890, at age 70, Brother Wrights was understandably looking forward to retirement. And he had already asked not to be re-elected to PEC at that year's Senate. One last task, however, needed to be accomplished. The long-suffering Cherokee Nation was once again disturbed by plans and rumors about what changes the federal government was going to make in their status versus what was to become Oklahoma. Someone from here needed to go out there, assess what this would mean for our Cherokee mission, do what he could to help, and bring news back to Salem. Well, this task fell to our brother Christian Lewis Wrights, and this was supposed to be his last official act as president of PEC. So off he went. In the meantime, however, his own son, Theodore, who had served in the mission since 1877, had had to leave mission service to earn enough money to support his family. Christian Lewis could certainly identify with that. Christian Lewis agreed to stay with the mission over the winter of 1890 and 91 to at least keep things going until other arrangements could be made. There, 1,000 miles from home, he died in the Cherokee capital of Tahlequah on 9th January 1891. From Salem, Augustus Fogel took a wagon to retrieve Brother Wright's body. He brought him back to Kernersville, where after a long life of self-sacrificing service, he was finally laid to rest in Kernersville's God's Acre. Well done, good and faithful, if not always grammatical, servant. By the way, this was not the first time Augustus Fogel had to fetch the body of a PEC president back from a visit to the Cherokee Mission. In 1854, Bishop John Gottlieb Hermann died while on a trip out there. He died in Missouri, and Augie Fogel was sent to bring him back to Wachovia. This is why, when Bob Sawyer was president of PEC and we were reestablishing our relations with the Cherokee, and Brother Sawyer announced he was going to Oklahoma for a visit, I advised caution. You might want to rethink that, Bob, I said, particularly since Augie Fogel isn't available to fetch you home again. Fortunately, Brother Sawyer went and returned well and happy. We come now to one of the most important bar none, figures in Wachovia history from the very beginning to this very day, and this is Adelaide Lizetta Fries, whose one-word inscription on her gravestone pretty well says it all: Archivist. Born in Salem in 1871, she was descended on one side from the Yeshkas, some of the first Czech refugees to participate in the forming of Herrnhut, and on the other side from Zinzendorf himself. No one had more being Moravian in their blood than she. In due time, she did what young Moravians of genteel Salem families did. She graduated first from the academy and then from the college. She also earned a master's degree. She never married. I suspect that no mere man could have been a worthy consort for her. Well, a possible exception is Dr. Hans Kalberland, the first doctor in Wachovia. It seems pretty obvious to me that she carried a pretty big torch for him in writing The Road to Salem, a novel about Anna Katrina. Sadly, Dr. Kalberland had died in 1759, caring for victims of a typhus epidemic before succumbing to it himself, so he was not available. In light of recent events, though, this event seems more poignant. Miss Adelaide did not take her interest in Moravian things lightly. In 1899 and again in 1909, she spent a summer in Herrnhut doing research in the Unity archives. Now she was ready for her life's work. Upon her return from Herrnhut, she persuaded her father, who was a lay member of PEC, to get their permission for her to supervise the occasional sweeping out of the archives room, which at that time was in the old boys' school on Salem Square. Now, anyone who knew anything about Miss Adelaide should never have been fooled that all she wanted was to occasionally have the archives swept. In fact, once she got in there, they couldn't get her out. PEC eventually gave up, and in 1911 they appointed her archivist. Now her real work would begin. She busily sorted, organized, edited, and prepared for publication 7 volumes of her monumental records of the Moravians in North Carolina. She also wrote many other books and articles along the way. Miss Adelaide did not publish every word of these records, but she had a unique nose for news to zero in on the really important and interesting parts. She was also very accurate in her translations. Like all of us, she could make a mistake, but not very often. One I remember is when she said someone died rather than got married. I would love to know if that was a Freudian slip. Do not think, though, that Adelaide Fries just sat quietly producing her scholarly works. At the Provincial Synod of 1917, women were still not permitted to be delegates. Miss Adelaide, however, delivered a major and powerful address, and everyone was impressed. By 1923, women had gotten the vote nationally, and the rules had changed to permit women delegates. She was taking no chances, however, by counting on being elected as a delegate from home church. She informed PEC that she was going to be a full participant at Synod, and it was up to them to figure how to credential her to make that happen. That is why, to this day, the provincial regulations list the provincial archivist as a full member, voting member of Synod. Thank you, Ms. Adelaide. She was also tireless in speaking in the congregations on the importance of sending in materials to the archives. In later years, her pastor at home church, R. Gordon Spall, recalled that numerous times when she met him on the streets of Salem, she would say, "I won't be in church on Sunday, I'm preaching." And that's what she meant, preaching the gospel of history, which, like the historical books of the Bible, recount the dealings of God with his people. She was recognized far beyond the southern province for her numerous publications and work with state and national historical associations. She received not one but 3 honorary Doctor of Letters degrees, one from Moravian College, one from Wake Forest College, and one from the University of North Carolina. Miss Adelaide had a way of getting what she needed. At the outbreak of World War II, the old Forstair house at the corner of Bank and Main Streets was in the process of being renovated as a new home for the archives. However, with the coming of the war, all building supplies had to be diverted from civilian to military needs. For instance, the new sanctuary being constructed for the Advent congregation had to sit derelict and open to the weather until after the war. That was not good enough for Miss Adelaide and the archives. Calling upon some well-placed relatives and other useful acquaintances in the government, she was assured that there was no shortage of building materials to complete the archives house. Even federal bureaucrats had trouble saying no to Miss Adelaide. She was generally kind and gracious to those who needed her assistance. Self-importance and presumption, however, got nowhere with her. One day, the archives doorbell rang, and upon opening, she found the famous and distinguished musicologist standing there, who said, "Hello, I'm Dr. Rao from Bethlehem, and I'm here to catalog your music." With raised eyebrows, she simply said, "I think not," and slammed the door in his face. After several apologies, numerous letters of recommendation, and humble requests for access, I believe Dr. Rao was later allowed in the building, having learned the wisdom of the adage, "Don't mess with Miss Adelaide." Her concern was not just with the past. Her heart was greatly touched by reports of the sufferings of Moravians on the European continent after the total devastation of World War II. As Gordon Spall said in her memoir, this need was a challenge to her, and she met it as she met every other challenge that came to her during her life, by doing something about it. She personally gathered necessary supplies and packed and shipped countless packages to ease the suffering of her Moravian brothers and sisters on the continent. Here again, though, God was still at work among God's people. She remained busily engaged in her numerous activities until she was called into the more immediate presence of the Savior in the early morning hours of November 29th, 1949. We shall not see her like again. But I'll bet God's heavenly archives are not only swept out, but better organized than they've been in millennia. The next, and about the last person I want to look at tonight, was neither a minister or a provincial official, but in the very best sense of the word, a character. He also happens to be the oldest person, so far, I've ever known. I'm referring to Brother John S. Teague, a long-term member of Emmanuel. As a boy in the early 1960s, I would sometimes go to Brother Teague's house in the summer to read the Bible to him, since by then his eyesight wasn't what it used to be. We were sitting out in his backyard, having finished the passage for the day, in which Brother Teague had kindly corrected my pronunciation of some of the harder Hebrew names. It was a nice day, so we sat talking a while more, and I asked him, "Brother Teague, did you ever serve in the military?" He answered, "No, I never had the opportunity." We lived way out in the country and only came into town a couple of times a year, so the Spanish-American War was over before we heard it was on. And by World War I was too old to serve. I realized that being born in 1880, he was old enough to vote when Queen Victoria died, 2 years before the Wright brothers flew the first airplane. He was an adult. He was also able to vote for Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. Brother Teague had little formal education. He had managed to get some training at a business school, but places weren't hiring. He therefore taught school for 5 years. In those days, you didn't have to have a college degree or a teaching certificate. If you could read and write, do some addition and subtraction, and a little multiplication and division, you were good to go. Fortunately, in 1910, after Smith Phillips Lumber Company opened, he got a job there. Finally feeling financially secure, he married his sweetheart, Mattie Hooser, on Easter Sunday. Over 70 years later, he was still indignant over having to pay the ridiculous sum of $10 for a new suit to get married in. It turned out to be worth the cost, for he and Mattie were happily married for 60 years. He also continued to work for Smith Phillips until he was 79. I was also told that in the 1920s, Brother Walter Allen Sr. had been trying for a long time to get John Teague to join the church. Brother Teague was faithful in attendance and even provided his own living room for Wednesday evening prayer meetings and Bible study. He simply couldn't quite decide to be baptized. At the close of one session, though, Brother Teague suddenly said, "Brother Allen, I'm ready. I want to join the church." Brother Allen surprised everyone by saying, "Wait right there," and went running out the door. He ran down the street to the church, which was just around the block and around the corner. In a few minutes, he returned, breathing hard, with the baptismal bowl and pitcher. He proceeded to baptize Brother Teague on the spot right then and there. Now, Brother Allen knew as well as anyone that applications for membership need to be approved by the Board of Elders. But as he later said, I wasn't about to let him get away. No one ever brought up the irregularity, and Brother Teague remained one of Emmanuel's most faithful members until his death in 1984 at age 104. Brother Teague always entered the church by the door facing Peachtree Street, and to the right of the door there were a couple of pews on which nobody ever sat. And as he came in, Brother Teague, without a glance, would sail his hat like a frisbee onto one of those pews, regular as clockwork. On one occasion, I don't remember whether it was an anniversary or what, the church was crowded and a couple of visitors were seated on those pews. Brother Teague came in and, as always, set his hat flying directly at one of the visitors. It's fortunate it was a soft-brimmed hat, or we could have had an incident similar to a scene in a later James Bond film where the Oriental villain decapitates a statue by throwing his assassin hat at it. In this case, after an apology, all was well. For his last years, Brother Teague was at the Moravian home. He couldn't see too well, and his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he was otherwise still very fit and active. In fact, at mealtimes, he would assist the staff in rolling residents who were confined to wheelchairs down to the dining room, and some of these were 25 years younger than he was. At age 100, he was still taking exercise classes and said he was in good health and feeling fine. He also said, "I think good hard work has helped me. I tell these young people today that they will be healthier and live longer if they work harder." I was pastor at Emmanuel in the early 1980s, and whenever I would visit him at the home, he would insist afterwards not only on walking me to the exit, but also on holding the door open for me. I said, Brother Teague, I appreciate it, but you really don't have to do that. I was frankly a little embarrassed for folks to see a 104-year-old gentleman holding a door for me who was, I think, 36 at the time. He replied, my mama told me always to show respect for my pastor, and as long as I can, that's what I'm going to do. I never protested again. Even at 104, he was still doing what his mother had ingrained into him as a child, and who could argue with that? Well, that's about all I have to say. I do hope, though, if you are not too worn out, you will allow me to make just a few closing comments. Some of you may have been surprised that I made only a couple of passing remarks about Bishop Edward Rontaller. To even begin to do him justice, however, would take at least an hour's lecture in its own right. But I think one story about him, though, may provide a fitting closing to this talk. Bishop Rontaller remained very active throughout all his years. At 80, his daily schedule was more than I would have wanted to tackle at 40. As he grew older, however, he noticed that his eyesight was fading. This grew worse, and fearing that he was going totally blind, he resolved to memorize his favorite book of the Bible so that he could have comfort repeating to himself the beloved words when he could no longer see them. This was the Gospel of John. One day when he was walking uptown, he encountered a friend, and he knew everybody, a friend standing outside his place of business. This man happened to be an optometrist, and the bishop mentioned to him his failing eyesight and his resolve to memorize John before it was too late. The man looked at him closely and said, "Give me your glasses." Mystified, the bishop complied, and the man drew a polishing cloth from his pocket and proceeded to give the spectacles a good hard wipe. He then returned them to the bishop. A miracle! The bishop's blindness has been cured and his eyesight restored. In light of this story, I offer the following closing prayer. O Lord, give us your grace and wisdom to see through the external things which cloud our vision, that we may behold your true light. We may not know the way, but we do know you, the one who is the true way, and we know that we may follow you without fear, whatever betide, with courage for the future. Amen.
I invite Eric Elliott to come forward now. We continue our committed support to the Moravian Archives of $1,000 per year for 5 years. I call on Mr. Thomas William, past president of our society, for the presentation of the Archie K. Davis Award.
Each year, the Board of Directors may select a person to receive the Archie K. Davis Award. This award is named in honor of a man whose contributions in many fields enriched the state of North Carolina and beyond. As a banker, a legislator, a churchman, and a historian and author, in all of these fields he excelled. He was a strong supporter for our society over many years. Recipients of the Davis Award are selected in recognition of their achievements, reflecting Archie Davis's example. This year's recipient is a native of Winston-Salem, where his family has long been involved in the business, cultural, and religious affairs of our city. His roots, however, trace back to the Freedburg community. He is a graduate of R.J. Reynolds High School and Davidson College. He served in the United States Army during the Korean War. Now retired, he had a very successful career as a stockbroker. He has a lovely wife, and they have three children. Our recipient is a lifelong member of Home Moravian Church, where he has served as an elder and a trustee. He has served on various church boards and committees. He served as a member of Salem Congregation, the board of that organization, and in addition to his church work, he has been active in Forsyth Jail and Prison Ministry. He has delivered Meals on Wheels for senior services and has volunteered at the Shepherd Center. He is a member of Old Salem's Frederick Marshall Society. The man we honor has a strong interest in history, especially in that of Wachovia. He has for many years been a valuable member of the Wachovia Historical Society, serving multiple terms on the board of directors, including 2 terms as president. Whenever there is a project or concern of the society, he is quick to lend his knowledge and energy. As an advisor, he continues to assist the board in carrying out its mission. Our recipient has a keen interest in the protection, preservation, restoration, and useful development of the Rock House property, which is owned by the society. This daunting task never discouraged his zeal, as he is an 8th-generation direct descendant of its builder, Adam Spock. For years of services to church and community and to the Wachovia Historical Society, for a keen interest in the early years of Wachovia, and for being a good resource for his fellow society associates, the Wachovia Historical Society gratefully presents its highest honor, the Archie K. Davis Award, to Frederick Foe Peck Spock.
Well, needless to say, I am so very, very humbled and flattered to be honored by this wonderful award, the Archie K. Davis Award. I've been involved with the Wachovia Historical Society for many years now. It is a wonderful organization and an enduring asset to our city, state, and country. My sincere thanks to the current board for selecting me for this honor, the Archie K. Davis Award. To be included with the group that has been recipients of the award in the past is an honor in itself. To wit, some scholars and authors, Daniel Cruz, Richard Starbuck, Rauschenberg, Graham Wright, Nola Canals, historians Paula Locklear and John Larson, Martha Mo Hartley, and then outstanding citizens such as Kopi Haynes and James Gray. It is, and the other recipients of the award, which have given great service to our community and the heritage that we enjoy. It's been a really very special thing for me. I do appreciate it. Many sincere, heartfelt thanks. Thank you.
Special thanks to Dr. Daniel Cruz for delivering our annual oration. Congratulations to Frederick Spock, our 2020 Archie K. Davis Award winner. Our board has voted to change our reporting to a calendar year. This was put into place for 2020. Memberships will be on a calendar year running from January 1 to December 31st each year. Membership pays currently will expire on December 31st, 2021. I encourage all members to consider stepping up a level as you renew your membership. Special thank you to Johnny Pearson and the annual meeting and Davis Award Committee for their time and preparation for our annual meeting. Arrangements for recording, so we were able to come to you via the internet. The many hours spent by all our committees in the work for your society. Special thanks to Paul Canals and his committee for their outstanding work on our communications. The Wachovia track continues to bring news of our society to you, our members. I want to say a special thank you to all our directors for their hard work and support over the past 3 years. In closing, I want to say a special thank you to Eric Saltzwedel for his recording and editing of this program tonight. Without him, this would not have been possible. I hope we all pass the lockdowns and special small meetings so we can again have our regular annual meeting next year. May God bless you all and keep you safe.